Hello, everyone. I am getting ready to start a hopefully brief video training for the Administration Code and Inclusion Code, which will be one of the two trainings that you will receive this year. The second training will be a face to face training toward the end of the year. But I am doing this training as part of the requirement because we have several state assessments that are given throughout the year, including Access, which is given to our students who are ESL. We also used to give the alternate assessment, but we no longer are giving that in our building. However, we still need to provide this training so that our students are receiving the proper accommodations so that they are prepared, so that they don't have any surprises when it comes time to give their state assessment. So I'm going to try to be brief, but I want to strongly encourage you to come see me if you have any questions throughout this and at any point in the year with any part of testing or anything that you think might apply to a situation where kids need accommodations or something along those lines. So this is a two-part training. I may have to break this up into a few video segments. There will be some questions in between that you'll have to answer. I don't think you're allowed to click off this window and just listen to my voice. I think it might stop my video if you do that. Not completely sure. But you'll have to answer the questions, and then you'll have a paper signature sheet that I'll need you to also sign once you've completed the questions and scored 80% or higher. And so, like I said, I may have to break this up into a couple of video segments, and hopefully you won't have any questions as we go along. If you do, you can just ask. The administration code is first. This is just the regulation that we are given to just explain what proper testing procedures should be happening throughout the year to ensure that all students receive an equitable testing environment. Let's see if I can get my slideshow to advance here. I'm not going to go in depth with test security because that's something that we will go into depth with toward the end of the year. But I will say that when that comes around, we take that very seriously. So I really am just trying to get you more acquainted with making sure students are receiving the accommodations that they are to be provided based on their IEP, their PSP, or their 504 plan. And the IEP would be something that you will receive from a resource teacher. The PSP would be a student who is an ESL student, who you would get that from one of your ESL teachers. And then a 504 would be a plan for a student who might have a medical condition, but they may not necessarily receive an instructor one-on-one. They may just need some accommodations, and Miss Lacey takes care of the 504 plans. And so all of those possibly would have some accommodations with those. And so we just want to make sure that students are receiving those throughout the year. So when we do the testing, we will keep all the materials secure and safe. We want to offer students encouragement throughout the year. I know that what you will do to motivate your students while you're teaching is going to look a lot different than maybe what it would look like during a testing situation, since you are not allowed to give any feedback during a state assessment, but you can do that obviously while you are teaching. Coaching and editing, that's not acceptable during a state assessment, but it is, of course, what you do every day as a teacher. You are coaching and editing and helping them become better at what they are doing. It is very important that you do provide the accommodations, and we'll go into more detail about what some of those accommodations are when we get to the inclusion code. If you do not understand or have a question about one of the accommodations, please see a resource teacher or a ESL teacher or Miss Lacey, because it is very important that the kids, we don't get, halfway through the year or even, a few months into the year and you realize that you haven't been providing a reader for a student who is supposed to have a reader, or you have been providing a scribe for a student who doesn't have a scribe. We don't want to set a student up to put them in a situation where they might not be successful because they haven't been getting what they need. Classroom materials throughout the year, you will have organizers and things like that posted in the classroom, and that's perfectly fine. You are not allowed to post those during state assessments, and we'll go over what is actually allowed on the walls during state assessment closer to time, but basically we cover everything. Calculators, I encourage you to have students begin to practice with those, and not just at the very end of the year, but also, from the beginning, to understand the function and how to use those and understand. So if you're a 3rd grade through 6th grade teacher and you don't have a classroom set of those, please let me know and we will look into that. I keep looking at my time up here because I can do 10 minutes at a time. I don't want it to cut me off. Electronic devices. This is talking about having test administrators be on devices. So if this isn't really so applicable to during the school year, but mostly during an assessment, we encourage you to not be on your cell phone or computer during testing session. And this is talking about the walls and bulletin boards that need to be covered during a state assessment. And the instruction that's happening throughout the year would be normal instruction, even during the testing window. A regular review is normal. We are not to provide a test, how to take a test session, just to teach kids how to take tests, but you can teach those test-taking strategies as you teach your content. So that would be acceptable. We do create good faith effort checklists that we encourage students to use, and that includes checking their work, using some of those organizers. We cannot require particular organizers, but we can encourage students to use those. And I will talk, if you are not familiar with some of the organizers that we use for writing, particularly CAPE and SPAT, I can talk to you more specifically about that. I have a PLC date scheduled for that as a quick review, but if you're new or need a refresher, please let me know because we can talk about those as well. An allegation would be an accusation that something was done inappropriately, either by a student or a teacher or a proctor during a test session, and it happens sometimes accidentally and sometimes intentionally, and we obviously want to avoid them. And so here are some examples. I haven't been reading everything off the slides, but if you have questions, you are welcome to pause the video as you go through and read in detail the slides that are here. And we're getting ready to go into the inclusion code. So I think this is a good place to take a break, and I will ask a couple of questions and then we'll get into the specifics of that. Next is the inclusion code. Let me make this big here. Inclusion code will apply to students with the IEP, ESL students who have a PSP and 504 plans. We will go in depth to talk about the accommodations that students may have. Just as a reminder, the difference here, an accommodation versus a modification would be changing the expectation of what the work that should be done is. So if you look at the last bullet here, modifications change, lower, or reduce the learning. That's not something that we do on state assessments. In other words, everyone might receive that same test, whereas their accommodations, they kind of will bring up the student's ability to understand that content by allowing them a reader or maybe a scribe, depending on what the art committee might have decided that student needs to be successful. So that was not something that was always very clear to me, so I thought I might mention it. But the accommodations should not reduce the learning expectation. Um, we do make changes to accommodations from year to year. They should be faded as students get older and are able to become more independent. We try to we are hesitant to make changes near testing, but that does happen at times because students will have a meeting every year, and typically it's before their birthday. So that can sometimes fall around testing time. But we always try to consider the needs of the student, and it's always based on an evaluation and the data that is taken from the evaluation. So this slide here just kind of explains how some students have no accommodations, some will have accommodations, and then there's the alternate assessment students who also have different type of accommodations, which we do not have in our building this year. The English language learners, ESL students, also have accommodations. Many of their accommodations overlap with students with IEPs. There are very few that are even actually different. There's one accommodation that is simplified language that is very close to what is paraphrasing, which we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. But other than that, most of the accommodations are the same. So I will let you know when we get to that one. And here's a list of all of the accommodations that we'll be reviewing here in just a second. So here are the types of assistive technology. We do have students who have, we have hearing impaired students, and they have some sound field systems that are used. We also have some students in the older grades who use assistive technology to often type their responses. And so that's something that if it is on their IP, they should start practicing that. We don't want them to try to figure out how to do that in March when they are going to be trying to do that on the state assessment in May. So they would be able to use what's called a non-standard response template. We want them to be able to practice that all year long. So it's very important that they're starting to practice all of these accommodations beginning, in August. So if you're not sure how to help provide those accommodations, any of them, please let us know, let me know, ask someone. Don't ever be embarrassed to ask. Manipulatives, and this, I kind of like the way the new PowerPoint is set up. It has in parentheses what type of accommodation you might see these for. So you would see these on an IEP, a 504, and alternate assessment. You would not see these, the manipulatives, on a PSP for an ESL student. They would be free of writing for the students in our building who are taking assessments on the state assessment. Now, if they are using manipulatives for day-to-day learning, they can use manipulatives that have writing on them. That's fine. But once it comes to the state assessment time, they would not be permitted to use like fraction bars with writing on them. But of course, during regular instruction, that's fine. And there's an example there. There are different types of readers. You can have an adult or you can have text to speech. We have not done a lot of text to speech in our building. For the most part, we've used one-on-one adult readers. That's something that we have been practicing. So just a couple of pointers and reminders for that. They are to not be leading. We want to try to read things with as little inflection in our voice as we can to not lead a student to an answer. And that they would not be a replacement for regular instruction. The rereading, that was something that changed a few years ago. A student does not have to ask for these accommodations, but if they want something to be reread to them, then they must ask for it to be reread. So on an initial first reading, then you can just begin to read. But if you look at them and you think, well, they look a little confused, we want to start encouraging them to say, would you please read that to me again? And that's something that they would need to practice. The scribe would be, it's challenging because you have to write word for word what the student says, and you're not allowed to punctuate or put capital letters in what you're writing. And so you want to practice this with students, and the best way that we've kind of found is this child would say, if it's the dog is running through the field, the child would say the dog is running through the field. You would write that down with no capital letters or punctuation, turn your paper around and say, okay, now you can put in the punctuation and capital letters, and let the child do that, or they can tell you where they want the capital letter and period or punctuation to go at the end. It's definitely something that takes practice and needs to be done all year long. Calculators, something I want to say about calculators, not every student who has an IEP or a 504 will have a calculator, or not even every student who has a math disability will have a calculator. So it's important to make sure that you check the IEP very carefully to make sure that they do have that to use all the time. Now, every student will have certain sections of the state assessment that they will use a calculator for, but there are also parts that they are not allowed to use them on, and unless they have that written in on their IEP. And there are certain calculators that are permitted for students with an IEP that other students may not normally access. So those would be like the TIAP 15 would be written in. Some students use those. Here's paraphrasing or simplified language, and they've combined them together because they are basically the same. They are for directions only. So a reader, you can read the whole test or the whole assessment questions, multiple choice responses, but a paraphrasing or simplified language is just for the directions. You can't do anything else. You can't read a passage or paraphrase the passage. It's basically changing one word for another. And so if it's just the directions, and the example I always give, because it's the one I can think of, and I think the one that was given to me was the word assessment is changed to the word test if they say they don't know what that word means. So we are going to take another small break, and we will finish this recording up in just a moment. So I will be right back after a couple more questions. The next accommodation is for students who have a PSP. Those are bilingual and English dictionaries, and they can be print or electronic, and they can be used throughout the year during regular instruction and on state assessment. However, during state assessment, we do not use the electronic ones because we have to have the internet capabilities turned off, and that's very difficult to manage, and so we typically use just the paper versions during K-Prep. The extended time is something that we've tried to begin practicing early on because we, many years ago, did not have limits on how much extended time students could use, and now we have either time and a half or double time. So if regular time is 30 minutes, then time and a half would be 45 and double time would be 60. So it's great for you to start practicing that now with students, even in the younger grades, so that they can get used to managing their time wisely, even if they have to start out going over that time and working their way down. It gets them used to trying to work within those time limits and the constraints. Reinforcement behavior modifications, those vary depending on the child. We provide accommodations for many students, even those who do not have IEPs and 504s. They can be a verbal or something that is tangible, or extra time on a device, or check and connect. Those are permitted during state assessment if it's something that's been provided all year long. So we just want to continue to make sure that it's something that's not only documented on the IEP and the 504, but that is done consistently. We do have students who are hearing impaired, and they the interpreters are aware of their abilities, of what they can and cannot interpret, depending on what is listed on their IEP. But that does need to be listed on the IEP of what their disability is. They cannot indicate correct answers, which would be leading, obviously, or teach any vocabulary throughout the instruction. And that pretty much sums up the brief version of our training. Like I said, this is a very short version of what we will do in the spring. I think it's very important for you to take away the idea that you need to know what accommodations your students have. You need to know your students. You need to get to know the resource teachers and the ESL teachers and feel comfortable asking them questions. Feel free to ask me questions. If you want me to get with you again and go over any part of this, I am happy to do that. Please let me know. I will need you to please sign the signature sheet and return that to me. And then that will complete this training. And I hope that you have a wonderful day.